episode 18 of the Mini Sculpting Super Show. I'm your host Tom Mason, and today we're going to talk about how to prepare your miniature for mold making. Before I get into that, I wanted to tell you all a couple things. Well, one, we've crossed over 5,000 subscribers since the last episode. I'm blown away, super excited. So yeah, thank you so much for continuing to watch, continuing to subscribe, and continuing to support these videos. It makes it really exciting to see how many people are learning about sculpting and getting into this. The second thing I wanted to tell you about is about Adepticon. It's coming up towards the end of March. I think it's the 23rd, the weekend of that, in that area. And I'm teaching 2 sculpting classes there. So if you're going to be there and would like to come and take part, or even just hang out and say hi, I would love to see you. One of my classes is on Friday. It's how to sculpt with polyclay, and the other one is on Sunday, and that's teaching you how to sculpt faces. And they're gonna be great hands-on classes, and I would love to see you there at the class or just at the show. I'll be hanging around Thursday night all through Sunday, and I hope to see you there. But for now, let's get sculpting.
First thing you'll need is the medium we're going to be using to sculpt with. Right here I'm going to be using ProCreate putty. It's a 2-part epoxy putty. You mix together and it self-cures. And I'm also going to add in a little bit of Aves Apoxie Sculpt. It's another 2-part epoxy putty. I like mixing them together because it makes it a little softer and easier to manipulate, and it also cures very quickly and very hard. But you can use any putty. I wouldn't use Fimo for this because at this stage your figure's either going to be a cured putty figure or a baked Fimo figure, and we want to have something that can just stick very easily to the miniature and then cure all by itself. Next, I'll be using these 3 tools. You might see me use a few others, but they're just variations of these. But this is really all you need is a color shaper. This is my flat chisel here, although I think I use this round taper as well, just to get into some of make things a little smoother in the rounded areas. And I've got the small burnisher, which is good for packing the putty down into the crevices where we're going to be filling in undercuts. And lastly is the scalpel here, or an X-Acto blade will work as well. And this is just to trim off any excess putty that you may need. The first thing you need to do when you're getting your miniature ready for molding is you have to remove it from the sculpt stand. Whether it's a piece of cork or this wood block, you need to get it off there. It'll be very easy to take off if you have used Fimo for sculpting your miniature. However, if you've done it all in putty like I have with this character, this barbarian, it'll be much more stuck to the base. So first thing you do is, if you're using one of these pin vise blocks, is you need to loosen up the nut and bolt there, and then very, very carefully slowly work under an X-Acto blade or a scalpel to pop it off, as you see there. Now, as you see, some of the putty can squeeze down into the vise, creating these little rough areas. So all you do from there is you just take your scalpel and you trim them off so that the feet are nice and flat. And there you go. Figure's all cleaned up and ready to go. This next part I'm about to show you and talk about is finding the mold line, and it should really be done way before you finish the miniature. You need to really have figured this out when you're making the armature, essentially. And it's not that it's gonna be bad for the figure or good for the figure, but you just have to know ahead of time if you're gonna have to cut this miniature up. Now, as you can see here, I designed this miniature to be a single piece casting, and it rests very nicely along the mold plane. Even though the sword goes in a little bit when it's at that angle, if you turn it just like this, you can see that it will have half the miniature on one side of the mold and half the miniature in the other side. And I'm showing you this, and why you need to kind of look at this and take this into account is you need to try and get rid of undercuts, which he actually has a lot of them under the skirt, and we'll get into that now. Now that you're aware of how the miniature will go into the mold planes, you can start to take a look at where the undercuts are and where you'll need to end up filling in with putty.
in order to make sure that the mold doesn't get trapped underneath the miniature, thus tearing it and not casting properly. So an undercut, really, if that doesn't make sense for what I just said, is anything that can't, where the mold will have to go up into and under the miniature. So it basically, it'll keep the miniature from being pulled free of the mold. So you basically want to try do as much as you can to make your miniature have a flat, flush area to be pulled from. For instance, under the skirt, there's a huge empty cavity, and if we left that empty, the mold will press up into there and solidify, and then every time this thing would be molded, there would be a void there, but there'd be this flap of rubber, and it would be difficult to pull the miniature out. So in order to alleviate that, we're going to fill that in, so that essentially, if you look straight on at the miniature, there will be a flat plane going from the front of the kilt, skirt, whatever, to the back. And that kind of will, that will allow, that's the word I was looking for, draft. It'll allow the figure to just pull right free of the mold. So I showed you a little bit of this in the last video with the capes, where we had to pack in the putty. So I'm starting here with a little bit of putty, and this is just my ProCreate and Aves mix, but you can do this with straight green stuff or straight ProCreate, whatever you have available that will self-cure. And I'm starting by putting a little bit in and working it in with my small burnisher, and I might have used a needle tool there a second ago. I certainly did on the last video, but you basically need something small to start packing that all in. Once you start getting the smaller amounts pressed in there, you got to make sure you do it all over first. But once you get the smaller amounts, then you can start adding some slightly larger pieces of putty to force in. But you don't want to get too large too early, otherwise, because I can trap a lot of air pockets. And that's the whole purpose of this. You're trying to fill in all of the empty spaces and voids. In this case, the skirt, the way I sculpted it, has some voids in it. Normally when I'm sculpting, you just try and avoid having voids at all. You'll put on a very solid full piece of putty or Fimo and make sure that that's already there. But sometimes when you're doing these cape pieces and other elements that are very thin and you just need to lay them onto the miniature, you can end up having a lot of gaps there. So now when I continue to fill this in, I'll talk a little bit about other undercuts. So this figure, again, I tried very thoughtfully to design it so that there wouldn't be many undercuts at all from the beginning, just in all the parts of the miniature. This was one spot that knew I was going to have to take care of afterwards, and that's fine, and it will end up having a nice draft to pull out of the mold very well. But sometimes you might have other undercuts besides these large cavities, and big things to look for when you're trying to fill in these undercuts is the head, especially under the chin. If you have a character that's kind of leaning forward with their head looking down and neck out, that can create a couple problems. One, the chin can actually create an undercut, which isn't bad because the miniature usually can be popped free and everything, but what will happen is if you have the head going too far forward up into one part of the mold, and this can be the same for hands and arms, but the head's a big culprit, it can create an undercut, and it can also get kind of trapped up in that cavity, which can make it difficult for the piece to cast after it's even been molded. You'll see here as I continue on filling it in, we've gotten much farther along. There's a lot more putty. The whole gap is very close to being filled. What I like to do, you can leave this part a little rougher if you want, because it's going to be not really seen very well. It's underneath the miniature, and you're really not going to see it when it's on the tabletop. But I like to try and make things look nice and smooth and finished everywhere it is. So that's where you'll see, once you get everything kind of mainly pressed in there and formed into the cavities, into the undercut areas, that's where I'll go back in with the color shaper, and I'll start smooth it out. You just want to make sure everything's nicely blended together in order to kind of have that finished look. And then if you have some excess, just trim it off with a Scalpel or the small burnishing tool. The last thing I want to point out on this endeavor as we're filling in the undercuts here is you really need to be checking as you're going. As you get farther along, you'll have to check and look and make sure that you want to make sure that there's as much of a straight line, so to speak, from the front shape to the back shape as you can. So in this case, the skirt is a little lower in the back than in the front, but that's okay. But that just means that rather than having the back just dipping down all by itself, I basically have created a imaginary line from the bottom of the front of the kilt to the bottom of the back. So it's kind of at a slope rather than going straight back from the front and then all of a sudden the back of the kilt is dropping to the bottom. And that's the sort of things you really have to watch out for. You just want to make everything as smooth and easy to pull out of the mold as possible. It'll make your molds last longer, and it could potentially make it cheaper because it will be easier to mold for the mold makers. And cast. It could make castings cheaper because it'll take less time for them to pull the figures from the mold. Alright, I'm just about finished filling in the undercuts. I'm going to do a last little bit here. You'll see, as I was just talking about in the last part. So I just want to take this time to thank everybody for watching the video and supporting the channel, especially my patrons. If you'd like to become part of the Patreon community, just follow the link over in the top corner and the bottom of the description and join the community and see how you can help the Mini Sculpting Super Show and get some cool rewards in the process. As always, I look forward to reading your comments about this video and interacting with you guys. So thanks again and keep sculpting.